Hello, I'm Cort Lindahl. Welcome to Mysteries and Legends of Northern California, Episode 3. In our series about Mount Shasta, we've been discussing a lot of the historical overtones of the myths and legends of Mount Shasta. Now, this is not to say that there is no city within the mountain or any of the other attributes that a lot of the beliefs that people have may indicate. We're here just to inform everybody of the historical overtones of what is going on there and why it may have been considered a special place. This may be the reasons why the things that you believe happen at Mount Shasta. Though I somewhat question the existence of a city in Mount Shasta, I've never been inside Mount Shasta to see if there is indeed anything there. So, where do the myths and legends of Mount Shasta really come from? Most of the modern myths and legends of Mount Shasta come from a book called A Dweller on Two Planets by Frederick Spencer Oliver. Though this book was first published in 1906, it was said to have been written in 1886. A Dweller on Two Planets reveals many concepts that we see today at Mount Shasta, including the city of Telos, the beings that live there, flying ships in the air, and Bigfoot. Surprisingly, most of the information in A Dweller on Two Planets had already been written and spoken of in France in 1885 by a man named Alexander Saint-Yves. Saint-Yves wrote another book based on the subterranean city of Agartha in the Himalayas that contains all of the same characteristics and highlights that Oliver included in A Dweller on Two Planets. Saint-Yves' book, The Mission de Indi en Europa, also exposes a city beneath the mountain, the beings that live there, flying airships, and the Yeti or Bigfoot-like creature. So it's very interesting that both of these books came to be during the same year. In 1886, both of these volumes were said to have been published, and this is somewhat suspicious, leading to the possibility that there were French influences in the developments of the modern myths and legends of Mount Shasta. We also see French influences in the Society of the Cincinnati, at the Palace of the Legion of Honor in San Francisco, at the Frenchman's Tower we already discussed, and possibly we see Joaquin Miller, the poet of the Sierras, being aware of this entire scheme and expressing himself with his pyramid in Oakland due south of the peak of Mount Shasta. Joaquin Miller would also go on to have a commune on his property in Oakland before the turn of the 20th century and was known to be a student of Buddhism, further linking us into Eastern concepts in an appreciation of Mount Shasta by the poet of the Sierras, and really somebody that may have had a peripheral influence on the later Beat Generation and hippie movements in the Bay Area of San Francisco. Also not to be overlooked is the use of or actual belief in these myths and legends on the part of the Nazi regime of Adolf Hitler. They indeed did search the Far East for relics and concepts, as we see at the beginning of even the movie Indiana Jones, which takes place in Tibet and involves Nazi agents trying to find out what is going on. So that's not too far from the truth. This in turn again leads us to the Enochian concepts of UFOs, cities beneath the mountain, and all of this as later expressed by foreign or French interests in the era just before World War I and II. Is it possible that these concepts were introduced as an intelligence ploy to influence people, or is there more truth to the story? Here also in this same period we see Nicholas Roerich using these same concepts to possibly influence Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his vice president. We know Franklin was also interested in the Oak Island treasure mystery and was related to the same Lawrence family that the family of George Washington was related to. So the fact that Roerich was from Imperial Russia and had a great interest in these kinds of concepts may link him to the later exploits of Madame Blavatsky, or that he was in fact propagating or keeping alive her ideas of these myths and legends of the Far East. Whether this connects to Mount Shasta or not is another question, but it is clear a similar philosophy and group was at work in Europe and Mount Shasta. This connection between Alexander St. Eve and Mount Shasta and its mythology is amazing when one considers that Madame Blavatsky of the Theosophical Society adapted many of St. Eve's ideas about the East, subterranean cities, and the other common aspects we see to the mythology of Mount Shasta as applied by the faith-based groups there today that hold these beliefs. So here's yet another amazing connection that will link us from St. Eve's to A Dweller on Two Planets of Frederick Spencer Oliver, and some sort of theosophical connection in which these concepts were meant to be promoted at Mount Shasta as well as other parts of the world. Really, what we're seeing here with the involvement of Alexandre St. Eve is how later the Nazi regime became familiar with all of these concepts from the occult societies in Europe that had adapted these ideas a little earlier. So later, we see the Nazis even adapting the swastika and a lot of their philosophy about the Aryan race from what they perceived to be Tibetan folklore. Is it possible that the Nazis were being used just as later we see the Native American mythology and lore being used? It is clear via this chain of evidence that Madame Blavatsky was influenced by St. Eve, and in turn Nicholas Roerich was influenced by Madame Blavatsky. Is it possible that these two were kind of agents of Imperial Russia that later had influence on the United States government? We see them using the same concepts put forth by St. Eve and others, including the Nazis referring to Agartha as Asgard of the Viking culture. So they were again relating Eastern concept from another culture and interpreting them in a kind of Viking or Nordic framework that kind of fit their vision of the world better. So there's lots of variables here, and it is just very interesting that the Nazis gained all of their value possibly of UFOs. A lot of the things we see about Nazis and UFOs really may have their roots in the Book of Enoch and this Himalayan mythology that was promoted by French factions. Now, given all of this, it's terribly interesting that J.D. Hooker, whom the Hooker Oak in Chico is named for, had been to the Himalayas in the 1840s, long before any of these books were written. On his trip to Chico, in which the Hooker Oak was named for him, he made a trip to Mount Shasta with John Muir and Asa Gray of the Linnaean Society of London. One source has him discussing stories of the Himalayas around the campfire on this trip to Mount Shasta. Now, this is even more amazing when you consider that the works of St. Ives and Frederick Spencer Oliver were both comprised of channeled material. Neither men had actually been to the Himalayas. Now, both of them had heard of this somewhere. How is it that both of these books and concepts manifested themselves in the same year of 1886 on different sides of the world? Is it possible that all of these things had been arranged by a certain group or secret society? Now, some of these early explorers and historians of California would have included Russian citizens who occupied the colony in the North Bay area during the 1840s in California. There are theories that this Russian colony was responsible for the name of Mount Shasta. So there is an early Russian connection, and indeed a Russian imperial connection to the myths and legends of California. This is right at about the time that J.D. Hooker was actually visiting the Himalayan region in his travels in the Far East. So here we have a distinct Russian connection, with even some crediting the Russians with having named Mount Shasta. Also note the similarity in the motif of the California flag, including the bear and the red star. These are also two primary symbols of Russia. Is it possible that early explorers and settlers in the Mount Shasta area viewed the Native American mythology in their own terms? Did they see hints of the lapis exilis, the Nephilim, in the form of Bigfoot or other legends that the Native Americans had? Here in the creation myth of Shasta Springs, we'll see several references that kind of fit this Enochian overlay of appreciation of what's going on at Mount Shasta.
The Great Spirit and his family dwelt within, and the smoke curling up from the summit showed that the fire was burning on the hearth. Then a great storm came, and the wind blew the ocean against the mountain and made it tremble. The Great Spirit asked his little daughter to go up and quiet the storm, cautioning her not to look out, but to put forth her hand and make a sign before giving the command. The child clambered up the roof, did as told, and was about to descend, when her curiosity got the best of her. She wanted to see what the world looked like. She put out her head. The wind caught her by the hair, dragged her down the mountainside, and left her in the land of the grizzly bears. Near the mountain base dwelt a family of grizzlies. The old grizzly was returning home from a hunt with a young elk in one paw and a bludgeon on his shoulder. He spied the fair child unconscious on the ground. He lifted the little one tenderly and carried her to his home. The old mother grizzly pitied the child and gave her milk from her own breast and reared her as one of her own family. The girl grew up and married the eldest son of the old grizzly, and their offspring was a man. The grizzlies then were very different from the grizzlies now. They walked erect like men, carried clubs for weapons, and talked. When man was born, the grizzly nation rejoiced and was filled with pride. They united and built a wigwam for the young mother near the Great Spirit, and it is known now as Little Mount Shasta, or today, Black Butte. Many years passed away. The old mother grizzly became feeble and felt she was soon to die. Her conscience smote her because through all the years she had concealed from the Great Spirit the whereabouts of his child. She called the grizzlies together at the new lodge and sent her eldest grandson up toward the clouds to the summit of Mount Shasta to tell the Great Spirit where his darling might be found. When the Great Spirit heard, he was filled with joy and ran down the mountain with great speed. So great was his speed, the snow was melted and streams began to flow, and hidden watercourses were formed. And the fountain and springs along the Sacramento, including the wonderful Shasta Spring, began to flow as they continue to this day. The Grizzly Nation had assembled from all quarters of their domain and prepared a grand reception. As the Great Spirit neared his daughter's wigwam, he found thousands of grizzlies standing erect with clubs on their shoulders, in 2 files facing, one on either side of the door. As the Great Spirit sped down between the lines, shouts of welcome rent the air. He reached his child, but when he found her so changed, and that a new race had been created without his consent, he was seized with anger. His rage was fearful to behold. He looked at the old grandmother grizzly with such an awful countenance that she died on the spot. Then the grizzlies began to howl and lament. The Great Spirit lifted his daughter tenderly in his arms and before departing turned to the grizzlies and cursed them in his fury. "Be silent," he cried. "Never again speak. Stand erect no more. Use your hands as feet and look to the ground till I come again." And also drove the new race of men from him. He then closed the door of Little Mount Shasta and returned to his own wigwam, carrying his daughter with him, and they were never afterward seen. The grizzlies are still under his curse. They never speak or stand erect except when life is in danger, when the Great Spirit permits them to stand upright as of old and use their fists like men. The Great Spirit with his daughter long since returned to the island and beyond the sky. The wigwam is abandoned. The hearthstone is cold. Smoke no longer curls upwards from the summit of Mount Shasta.
So, does this Native American myth refer to what we might call Bigfoot in the 21st century? It may be that during the 19th century, this story may have been interpreted as meaning the Nephilim from the Book of Enoch and other biblical sources. While many people would like to believe that Europeans affected the spiritual mores of Native Americans, it's clear that they had a mythology and faith that included many of the same concepts that Europeans held in secret. So the way that Europeans reacted to this is interesting in the way they appreciated the myths and legends. What we're seeing here is the fact that the Native American legends of Mount Shasta may have made them think that European people had been there before and taught this to the Native Americans. This is a repeated theme in many contact era happenings between Europeans and Native Americans. So while it is possible that Europeans had contacted them in the past, it's equally as possible that Native American people had developed this mythology on their own as part of being a human being on the face of the earth. We all may have things in common that lead us to similar ends. This is true that the Native Americans had their own extensive mythology. It's also clear that there were European interests that would wish to manipulate their lore. In the process of this, it is possible that some of this was altered to match the European point of view. So all sides must be considered in this great mystery. In addition to the similarities we see between Enochian thought and the Native American legends of Mount Shasta, we also see a distinct similarity between the legends, mythology, and religious mores of the Himalayan region of the far east of Nepal and India. In fact, in episode 1 we discussed how botanist J.D. Hooker made a trip with John Bidwell of Chico and Asa Gray of the Linnaean Society of London to Castle Crags and Mount Shasta. One narration of this trip has J.D. Hooker assailing the other participants on this trip with stories of his adventures in the Himalayas from 20 years earlier. J.D. Hooker's trip involves him going to some of the locations that are actually thought of to be Shambhala and Shangri-La, and even the region where the entrance to Agartha is, the subterranean city that is referred to in Himalayan mythology. So we do see their mythology also having a great deal to do with distinct, identifiable mountains and myths of cities beneath the mountain and Bigfoot-like creatures in the form of the Yeti. So it's an interesting crossroads here at Mount Shasta between many different views of faith as interpreted in the 20th century in the Republic of the United States of America, where everybody has the freedom to choose what their faith is and what they believe or not. To see how these concepts may have manifested themselves in later California and Western history, let's look at the Palace of the Legion of Honor in San Francisco and the Maryhill Museum of Art and Stonehenge replica in Washington State that all show the hand of descendants of George Washington and the first families of colonial America in their construction. We also see the Society of the Cincinnati influence and some of the occult and Gnostic overtones that we see in the Rennes-le-Chateau mystery and other places.
The stories of the Palace of the Legion of Honor in San Francisco and the Maryhill Museum of Art and Stonehenge replica in Washington State exposes many strange and unknown facets of early America and California. Both structures are associated with the same family group related to George Washington that created the Kensington Rune Mystery, the International Peace Garden, the Hudson's Bay Company, the Virginia Company, the Beale Treasure Legend, Oak Island Treasure Legend, the Powder Magazine in colonial Williamsburg, St. Paul's Chapel of New York City, and the Newport Tower. Both the Palace of the Legion of Honor and the Maryhill Museum of Art may also contain interpretive art that may reveal many things about the mysteries that fascinate us. For many, it may be hard to believe that a family group that was motivated by both the concept of the Republic and the Jacobite cause in England and Scotland had created these conundrums, possibly to clue one into the true nature of the mysteries at hand. In past works, we have discussed how the concept of a New Jerusalem was transplanted to North America and may be interpreted from an English, French, Scottish, and American perspective. Many times a New Jerusalem would include an array of octagonal structure aligned with a chapel, as we see on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. In addition, the New Jerusalem concept seems to have been included in many mysteries and lost treasure myths, the most famous of which includes the Ark of the Covenant and other lost relics from the Temple Mount itself. These legends in turn lead us to the Rosicrucian mythology of the Man in the Mountain, as applied by Charlemagne, and the mythology of Mount Shasta and other places. The legacy of the Hill family, who were originally a first family of Virginia, includes the family traditions and values of the Washington family, as well as many other premier families of early Virginia and other colonies. Part of the strategy of many gentled groups of colonists was to have a valued representative at each new colony, as well as others in the West Indies, England, and Scotland. In this manner, many family ties became important beyond their value as family members, and these groups may comprise some of the more storied industries and institutions of the early and modern United States. The Hills were very successful in commerce and banking, and included the Great Northern Railroad among their accomplishments. Included in the Hill family was James Hill, the creator of the Great Northern, and Samuel Hill, who was an engineer and civic planner of note in Washington State. His role in the development of Washington's road system is interesting, given his descent from Lawrence Washington, the half-brother of George Washington. Mr. Hill was enormously successful and was also a collector of fine art and literature. Eventually, Mr. Hill would build the Maryhill Museum of Art in Maryhill, Washington.
The Maryhill Museum of Art is a fascinating place for many different reasons that go beyond its association with Samuel Hill, the Great Northern Railroad, and his ancestry that includes George Washington. When Samuel Hill opened the Maryhill Museum of Art in the early 1920s, Queen Marie of Romania attended the opening ceremonies. Queen Marie is an interesting and well-respected character who had a fantastic lineage that linked her to possibly Saint Germain and Prince Rupert of the Rhine, the first governor of the Hudson's Bay Company. And we have seen the Hudson's Bay Company involved in many of the mysteries, from the Kensington Runestone to now the Maryhill Museum of Art and the mysteries of Mount Shasta. So Queen Marie was the eldest daughter of Prince Alfred, the Duke of Edinburgh, and the former Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna of Russia, respectively, the son of Queen Victoria and daughter of Emperor Alexander II. So she came from a very impressive line. This is very reminiscent of Prince Edward in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and the influence he may have had on the Oak Island treasure. So it's very interesting that Queen Marie's legacy is intertwined with that of the Washington family and all of their associated families, including the Hill Railroad Empire. So it's interesting to speculate whether the involvement of Queen Marie, being really Russian royalty and possibly some of the only Russian royal blood remaining, is an interesting story in association with how the Russian monarchy came to an end during the communist revolution in Russia. So it's again interesting that we have the kind of images of Helena Blavatsky and Nicholas Roerich, with a former Russian colony having once existed in California, and now the involvement of Queen Marie in the Maryhill Museum of Art, where she donated many items of royal regalia and of Orthodox religious art. And indeed, she also donated quite a bit of art and items to the Palace of the Legion and Honor Museum, and was associated with Alma de Bretteville-Spreckels, who is also instrumental in keeping the Maryhill Museum of Art going after the death of Samuel Hill. So she managed that for many years later. She was a tireless patron of the arts, and we see the results of her labors at both of these fine museums.
Adjacent to the museum, Mr. Hill constructed a replica of Stonehenge in the form of a World War I memorial. This representative display of a temple, or temporally sensitive structure, fit the entire pattern of value of the octagonal powder magazine in colonial Williamsburg that the Hills were undoubtedly familiar with. Spatial qualities of the Maryhill Stonehenge seem to point to another example of Mr. Hill's fascination with monuments that is located on the border of the United States and Canada. Using an octagonal division, Mr. Hill's Stonehenge points to, or forms an arc on the globe that leads to the Peace Arch in Douglas, Canada, also constructed by Hill. The theme of the Peace Arch echoes the theme of the International Peace Garden, also on the border further east in Manitoba and North Dakota. The Peace Garden is an amazing New Jerusalem that appears as a linear park similar to the National Mall or the alignment of Place de la Concorde at Tuileries Garden of Paris, near the Louvre Museum. The Peace Garden includes an octagonal structure aligned with a chapel, thus suggesting its role as a New Jerusalem. The International Peace Garden is a veneration of the Temple of Peace of Rome, built by Vespasian in the 1st century. Amazingly, the linear orientation of the Temple of Peace of Rome, along with the fora of Julius Caesar, Augustus, and Trajan, forms an arc on the globe that points to the International Peace Garden. Part of the landscaping of the International Peace Garden also resembles the planned view of the Temple of Peace in Rome. In turn, the octagon of the International Peace Garden points the way to Chico, which in part explains what we learned in the first 2 episodes about that town in California.
The Temple of Peace of Rome is an important place in that the temple treasure was once displayed there. The temple treasure was taken from the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD by Titus and brought back to Rome, where it was displayed in the Temple of Peace. After the Visigoths invaded Rome, the fate of the treasure was never known of again. A great deal of mythology and lore has sprung up around the temple treasure and other biblical relics that may have been displayed at the Temple of Peace. In this way, it is interesting that the Temple of the Peace of Rome is venerated at the International Peace Garden on the border of the United States and Canada. Note here how the planned view of the Temple of Peace of Rome resembles the Palace of the Legion of Honor in San Francisco and Paris. Well, let's have a look at the Palace of the Legion of Honor in Paris and how it relates to the three-quarter size reproduction in San Francisco built by Alma de Bretteville-Spreckels. The Palace of the Legion of Honor in Paris is adjacent to the Axe Historique, or the historical axis of Paris, that's comprised of the Place de la Concorde, the Tuileries Garden, and the rest of the alignment that reaches out to the Arc de Triomphe and beyond to Les Grandes Arches, which was added recently. Here we see the octagonal form of the octagonal basin that's part of the Tuileries Garden, first built during the time of Louis XV, creating an arc on the globe that extends to San Francisco and the Palace of the Legion of Honor there. This is only a short distance, the octagonal fountain in Paris, from the Palace of the Legion of Honor there, that also has an octagonal motif in the rotunda. So a measurement taken from that building would not differ from this. The Palace of the Legion of Honor of Paris actually points to the Palace of the Legion of Honor in San Francisco. This is likely an intentional arrangement. And here we see how the Palace of the Legion of Honor is oriented to point to the octagon at the International Peace Garden on the border of the United States and Canada. Indeed, all of this activity and all of these structures are linked together through a common philosophy and family that built such structures in part to possibly clue us all in to the true nature of this history. Then back at the Palace of the Legion of Honor in San Francisco, we also see this alignment leading to the Peace Garden, which matches the orientation of the building, including a kind of talismanic array of sculpture and artwork as well. Here we even see the large sculpture just to the east of the fountain in front of the Palace of Legion of Honor in San Francisco, being named Pax Jerusalem, thus echoing the theme of the International Peace Garden as a New Jerusalem. In this way, this sculpture is giving us a further clue as to this association. In this alignment of artwork, we also see a small glass pyramid of which a copy is present at the United Nations in New York. San Francisco was the birthplace of the United Nations, and the Palace of the Legion of Honor was indeed used as offices for the United Nations at that time. The rest of this alignment includes a statue of Joan of Arc and Rodin's sculpture of the Thinker that was brought to the United States by Alma de Bretteville-Spreckels. For her efforts in building the Palace of the Legion of Honor, Alma de Bretteville-Spreckels was made a member of the Legion of Honor of France. So what we're seeing here is a series of architecture that it appears were arranged to actually point to each other on the globe while still telling the story of the American and French revolutions with regard to the values of the Society of the Cincinnati of both France and the United States. Building a similar building in the Legion of Honor in both places is a kind of talismanic symbol that clues us into this value. So with this in mind, it's curious that earlier the Frenchman's Tower had been built in Palo Alto, and we kind of see this spiritual war kind of going on between the interests that built the Frenchman's Tower and people like Joaquin Miller and others that were likely associated with the Society of the Cincinnati. The Society of the Cincinnati likely saw value in being aware of the values of the royal class in the way they attempted to infiltrate Gold Rush era California. This was a time of exiled kings in France, so huge interest associated with that monarchy may have invested their money in Palo Alto and the stock farm known as the Ayrshire Farm there that would become Stanford University. So all of this does lead us to Chico, elements of the Rosicrucian order in San Jose, Guy Ballard, Henry Steele Olcott, and the rest of the people at Mount Shasta that had a hand in forming the myths and legends of the mountain there that have kind of turned into some mainstream religious beliefs over time as well. So we're not here to shed light or criticize people for their beliefs, just to add some historical context to what's going on and how it relates to older mysteries such as Rennes-le-Chateau and others in Europe. Thanks for joining me here on this episode 3 of the Mysteries and Legends of Northern California, Mount Shasta Revealed, and stay tuned for one more episode coming up soon. If you're interested in what you've seen in the last 3 episodes of Mysteries and Legends of Northern California, please see my book, Mysteries and Legends of Northern California, Mount Shasta Revealed by Bradbury Cort Lindahl. It's available at CreateSpace and Amazon.com, as well as the Cort Lindahl author page on Facebook. Thank you very much.